Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, who appears to be under threat. His job appears to be under threat after a very difficult week for him, in which quite a few of his top staff have been removed. And there are lots of whispers about the fact he may be about to be fired. This does go back to, although may not be directly connected to, Signalgate, in which Pete Hegseth's texts about bombing the Houthis were shared with the Atlantic's editor-at-large, Jeffrey Goldberg. But there have been lots of other murmurings of discontent coming out of the Pentagon, and there seems to be some sort of ideological clash going on between Pete Hegseth, possibly Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor. It's all very nefarious and hard to get to the bottom of it. But who better to get to the bottom of it with than the Spectator's editor-at-large, who has written about this, Ben Domenech. Ben, welcome back to Americano. We did talk, I think the last time we spoke was about Signalgate. And this story, well, first of all, how much do you think this story, this pressure that Hegseth seems to be under, how much does it go back to Signalgate?
Well, I think that the narrative that is in the wider press that this is connected to Signalgate is very commonly held. But just because something is common wisdom does not mean that it's correct.
Usually, and I think in this sense, the opposite.
It's actually quite the opposite. Signalgate was an embarrassment, but it actually was not as embarrassing, I think, as some people understand in terms of, who actually was hurt the most by it. The person who was hurt the most by it was Mike Waltz and his staff. Waltz had to do covering for his staff who actually, pulled the trigger and pulled things together. It was Hegseth's spin that was afterwards about the information that he was sharing that made him look bad. I do just want to hold up I know that we're not supposed to endorse, rivals within our business, but I did find it interesting that when the New Yorker put out their cover evoking the closing scenes, of course, of Dr. Strangelove, they have all these different cabinet people on it. Notably absent is Mike Waltz, and notably front of center is Pete Hegseth.
Put it, Ben, please put it a bit more in the center of the screen so that the viewers can see it.
Just, and I found that to be kind of interesting at the time, in part because I understand that Hegseth is more recognizable, than someone like Waltz, who's a little bit more nondescript looking. But it did seem to kind of be putting him front and center as the person that Washington found to be the most distrustful in this element. And let's go back and understand who these different people are. Mike Waltz has been around for quite some time. He worked, obviously, during the Bush administration. He was someone who had multiple roles at that time within the security infrastructure. He's 50. He's a little more established, and a guy who's an ex-Green Beret and someone who, at least in terms of Washington, is respected among the Republican national security set. That's not the same background that Pete Hegseth comes from. He comes from, obviously the class of the tattooed he codes as being a little bit more out of sync with the way that Washington expects their military leadership, their defense secretaries in particular, to look. Certainly, he doesn't fit the mold that people normally expect. And I think that there's a good bit of motivation, at least during his hearing, and the targets on his personal life, his background, and, his multiple wives and different, relationships that came under fire, that I think was indicative of that this is someone who doesn't really fit the Washington establishment's view of what a defense secretary should look like. His response to the Signalgate situation was not a good one. He made some pretty broad claims about the no war plans being discussed of any nature, as opposed to the more narrow claims that someone like Tulsi Gabbard was making about no actual violations of classified material, etc. And rather than stick to that narrow portion, Hegseth went wider. That prompted Jeff Goldberg to leak nearly the entire text chains, where you saw that there was actually something else interesting going on. which was an ideological discussion, a policy disagreement, really, between the vice president, between Pete Hegseth, between Mike Waltz, and between others within the administration about what to do in this circumstance. Now, we've discussed before, the president made a decision when he came back into office that he was going to have a spectrum of belief. He was not going to just go in one direction when it came to the ideology that he pursued on foreign policy, not just an America first, not just an isolationist, not just a neocon, not just a hawk, et cetera. He was going to have a spectrum of belief. And that includes, of course, someone like Marco Rubio and someone like Tulsi Gabbard. It's not just going to be one lane. And what I think we've seen is that within that spectrum, there are different points of contention and different viewpoints on the priorities within the world. And Pete, I believe, Pete Hegseth has occupied now a position that is slightly different than perhaps people expected. He was, of course, someone who joined up and fought within the war on terror of his own willingness back, in the day, and was someone who was traditionally viewed as being in the mainstream of the Republican hawkish lane. Yet he'd moved, of course, closer to President Trump over the years. Now, I think, after seeing that discussion and after some of the other public comments that he's made, and we can get into that, I think that he is now being viewed as someone who is an obstacle to some of the people who would like to see an approach in Ukraine, in Iran, and others that is more aligned with J.D. Vance and the things that he's been saying, less aligned perhaps with Marco Rubio, with Mike Waltz, and with others within the administration. And by virtue of being in this position at a moment when he's viewed as having a recent botch, I think that there are a lot of knives out for Pete Hegseth at this moment, chipping away at him. And that's something that has more motivations than just stumbling over yourself and spinning what was clearly a mistake.
Well, something we spoke about last time was the Israel-Iran factor in Signalgate. And we discussed the idea that perhaps Vance and Hegseth, and perhaps others too, were pretextualizing their conversation by making it about Europe. Vance was saying, I don't want to be bailing out Europe again because, all this shipping actually benefits Europe, not America. And while there may have been some purpose to that discussion, what they were actually talking about was whether we should be doing Israel's bidding on striking targets, Iran-linked targets. And since we had that discussion, there's been this interesting story about how close the administration may or may not have come to actually joining an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. And it seems it came pretty close. And if the reporting is correct, Hegseth sided against that. And the speculation is that a lot of the removals from Hegseth's office, particularly Dan Caldwell, who has gone on Tucker Carlson's show to say as much, they were removed because they were relatively dovish on Iran compared to the Hawks. And the speculation is the Hawks come from Mike Waltz's faction. And so it seems not just that knives are out in Hegseth's office, but also in Waltz's office. You're seeing some Israel Hawks coming under pressure and leaving. Is that the knife fight that's really going on? It's about very pro-Israel hawks versus people who are more dovish about Iran.
I think this is in very large part about the argument regarding Iran and what should be done there. And the fact that Hegseth is in this kind of no man's land in the middle, where he's viewed as being too hawkish for some of the people who are on the total pullback, we shouldn't be doing anything Israel wants us to do side. And also, at odds with some of the people who want basically to go in there guns blazing, means that he has critics from both sides. And that's why I think you saw the kind of total senior staff removal that happened over the course of the weekend. Really, you had three major staffers who were all senior, including Caldwell, who, by the way, used to work for Defense Priorities, which is one of the more I would not describe it as isolationist, but very restrained, very dovish entities in Washington, which have propped up basically since the war on terror. And he obviously already went and said his piece on Tucker Carlson. You also had, the former. He was essentially in line to be temporarily the spokesperson for the department, John Ulyat, go to the pages of Politico to unleash an absolute, blistering attack on what was going on in the Pentagon, describing it as chaotic and basically saying, I like Pete, but he's not the man for the job, essentially, in not so many words. And I think that a good part of this is that there are just different factions who are warring with each other about what the president really wants. The irony of all of this is that I think that the truth of the matter deep down is that the president is actually more hawkish on some of these things than some of the people seem to be willing to admit to themselves. Meaning that, if you look back at the presidents who have questioned the idea that the Iranian regime was one that we truly needed to fear for their, ability to upend the region, et cetera. The two most recent Republican presidents who really questioned that the most, of course, were Ronald Reagan, who just woke up one day and decided to eliminate the entire Iranian Navy over the course of a day in Operation Praying Mantis, and then, of course, Donald Trump, who decided that he was going to kill their top military leader, and not just in some private area, but going to the airport in the VIP area, And so the point is, Donald Trump has not shied away from, pulling the trigger when he thinks that he can do something against the Iranian regime. And what we've seen in recent years, I would argue, is that the Iranians have turned out to be rather a paper tiger when it comes to their response to some of these things. Now, at the same time, I think there are legitimate concerns that in this case, were the United States to allow Israel to do what they want to do in ending the Iranian nuclear program by force and with swift strikes, or at least try to, I think they'd probably, given the level of success that they've had in recent months with their other attempts in the region, I think that you could have a lot of faith that they'd be pretty successful at that. There are domino effects. There are growths of that could be very negative for the region. I think that's why you have people like Tulsi Gabbard and others raising concerns. But one thing that I do think is going on for Hegseth is, again, he is the least used to Washington of all of these people. Rubio has been there. Tulsi has been there. Mike Waltz has been there. They've all been around. They've all been on Capitol Hill. They all have these relationships. They all have these pre-existing stances. And even if people disagree with them ideologically, they're not viewed in the same outsider terms that Pete Hegseth is. And I say this as someone I should probably led with this at the beginning, as someone who considers Pete, a friend. We've always been friendly and cordial, and worked together at Fox News on multiple things. I think highly of him, and I know a lot of people in the military community who think highly of him. But this is also a very demanding job, one of the largest bureaucracies in the world, and to go in there with a bunch of people who are your military friends, who from the before time, but have very little experience in that building, if at all. That's a real challenge. And I think in this case, we've seen that's why he has not really been able to defend or protect some of his underlings the way that you might have seen from someone who is more experienced in Washington.
It's clear that he seems to have riled up the defense establishment, but something he's obviously good at is winning over Donald Trump. Early reports about how he got nominated were that he just sort of presented himself in Mar-a-Lago at the right moment, and it crossed Donald Trump's mind to appoint him, and that's how it happened. I don't know whether that's true or not, but those certainly were the reports.
That is what I've heard as well, yes.
And the rumors. And then last weekend, on Easter weekend, he did this extraordinary statement to the cameras with his sons behind, coming out firing. And this, again, during his nomination process, when he was under pressure, Donald Trump urged him to go on the front foot, to be aggressive. And in a way, it seems that rather than actually being under pressure, this might boost him in the mind of Donald Trump that, yes, he's coming under a lot of attack, but he's hitting back hard.
Yeah. I think that the things that have boosted him are, one, the initial Signalgate operation was obviously a success that has, from their perspective or the perspective of the president, continued. But the other thing is, but I have to admit, I did not think that the White House Easter egg roll was going to be as newsy as it turned out to be. Otherwise, I would have taken the time to go there. I thought I had to file an article, and so instead I did that. But I do think that his stance toward this is one that appeals to Trump, and at least temporarily is one that is going to actually put him on pretty solid footing. The idea that there is that the bottom's dropping out from under him, the walls are closing in, et cetera. I just don't think that's true yet, because one of the things that can happen is when you take that strong step forward, you have to back it up with the way things work out. And look, I don't think the president has any misgivings about riling the defense establishment, especially after his experience in his first term, where he was so frankly, angry, furious with some of the people he appointed, including people at the recommendation of top individuals to the defense and foreign policy space who turned out to be big disappointments to him, or even, betrayed him openly, turned against him in his 2024 campaign, including. And I think he views Hegseth as being intensely loyal, a strong fighter and someone who can go on TV and make this case for himself. At the same time, I think that Hegseth would be better served if he had some people around him who could make that case for him. It's only because John Kirby was so good at his job that people didn't really pay attention when Lloyd Austin just sort of disappeared for a couple of days and no one really knew where he was, which is a pretty, ridiculous thing to think about in retrospect. But look, Hegseth is certainly someone who I think is occupying this middle position where not everybody knows who they can trust in terms of what they're going to do, how they're going to respond to these moments. And he certainly comes out of this having been weakened by the fact that he had to lose so many of these people who had been close to him for a long time. Who he replaces them with could be critical in terms of how much of this reform agenda toward defense is successful in the months and years to come.
And lastly, Ben, could we just look at what's going on in the National Security Council? Because
Sure.
It's interesting that it's not just a case of the hawks killing the doves in the Pentagon, or realists, if you want, in the Pentagon, but there also seems to be quite a lot of things happening at the National Security Council. And on that side, it seems like the pro-Israel elements are being purged. What's going on there?
Well, I think sadly, for those of us, and myself included, who think that the priorities of Israel as an ally are ones that are aligned with the American and the Western interest generally. I think that there is an effort to purge some of those, and I think that a lot of that has to do with the reaction to some of what we've seen come out of Steve Witkoff's work in these early negotiations in Oman with the Iranians, where, frankly, what he's talking about has sounded a lot more like what the Obama administration and the JCPOA were attempting to do than the pro-Israel types are comfortable with. And that's something that I think was always going to be a point of contention, given that Witkoff was given such a broad sinecure in terms of his ability to just go around the world and have to, do all these different negotiations. I think at some point the president's going to have to make a decision about that, about which horse he's going to bet on in terms of things moving forward. And it certainly can't be something that makes the folks around Netanyahu feel all that comfortable, given the fact that they had expected, as with so many other expectations for this administration, it may not have turned out the way that the people going in wanted, that this would be an administration that essentially took the polar opposite stance from what the Biden administration had been doing over the last 4 years. Witkoff's role within this, I think, is critical, and the fact that behind the scenes he seems to be having such significant influence and downstream effects is something that I think concerns a lot of people, not just in the traditional hawkish sector of the Republican Party, but also those who view the Israeli conflict in particular as being a special case.
Ben, it's always fascinating to hear your insights. Thank you very much for coming on to Americano, and happy Easter.